Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Just imagine a time where the elite aren't afraid of laws or regulators of voters. The only thing they fear is an uprising of the people of what happens when vigilantes try to force constitutional reforms through targeted acts of violence. Our guest today will suggest new amendments to the Constitution like the Universal National Service and how a mix of targeted terrorist acts and massive peaceful protests can produce reform. Just imagine in this new novel, Public Enemies, our guest today is going to be talking to us about this very thing. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Jess Money. Jess, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you for having me.
Exciting stuff here. I understand that you do screenplays and screenwriting, things like that, and now you kind of put this in and we're talking about the Constitution. This is pretty exciting stuff, isn't it?
Well, it can be. It can also, be dull as yesterday's pancakes, depending on how you approach it, but the job of a writer is always to make whatever he or she is writing about interesting and accessible and in some cases provocative. So that's always the aim. Sometimes you don't hit the target, but I like to think that this time I did.
Now, in your book, Public Enemies, the antagonist proposes a number of constitutional amendments as a solution to the problem our country faces. Let's talk about some of these that you talk about here in the book.
Okay. Well, the whole premise of this is that principles are strong, but people are weak. And our forefathers set out to create a country of laws, not men. And unfortunately, over time, we've devolved from that position. And now we've got a whole tier of elite people that are essentially immune to prosecution for their wayward acts. So I looked at what we would need to change that, and one of those is a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to good government. It'll astound a lot of people, but the courts have actually held that there is no constitutional right, the voters have no constitutional right to good government, as absurd as it sounds. That nowhere in the Constitution does it say we're supposed to have good government. They kind of gloss over that part where the Constitution says we're supposed to provide for the common good. We need universal military service so that we don't go off on foreign adventures as the spear tip for American corporations. And if Jamie Dimon's daughter and Lloyd Blankfein's son are possibly going to go in harm's way, we're going to rethink a lot of that instead of sending the children of the poor and the patriotic off to get killed, maimed, mentally impaired for life with PTSD and so forth. We also need to fix things like gerrymandering. We need election integrity. It's a farce that right now we're talking about Russian influencing our elections, stealing our elections, all that kind of stuff. If, Putin's boys in Moscow could actually pull that off, that would be nothing more than an indictment of the weakness of our election system. The unaccountability of some of the electronic machines, the ability of those machines to be hacked, the lack of a paper trail in many cases, and the list goes on. We also need to abolish the president's power to pardon people in his own administration, of his party, donors, and so forth. Again, we're in a ludicrous situation here in which people are actually discussing whether the president should issue a pardon to the person who was the Democratic candidate for president. I mean, let that sink in. And we need an economic Bill of Rights. FDR proposed one in 1937, but we need a formalized national industrial policy that ensures that we're going to be as self-sufficient as possible, and we're going to concentrate our job focus on people in the United States here legally.
And it's interesting because as you looked at this campaign here for president, it seems that that's some of the things that now President-elect Donald Trump is talking about.
Yeah, he and Bernie both tapped into this great reservoir of angst and anger over our economic situation. It's, still the economy's stupid, and I think Bernie was a lot more sincere than Trump, but it's still, this is what caused people to turn out and vote for him. This is probably the most astounding election result in American history. It's certainly on a par with Dewey defeats Truman back in 1948, and it's going to be interesting to see as Trump fills his administration with traditional Republicans, and there starts to be the appearance that he's going to go back on a number of these pledges, how his supporters are going to do what the Democrats never did, which is, quote, hold Obama's feet to the fire. Now, how you hold somebody's feet to the fire, especially a president, is quite difficult. But representatives, especially in the House, hear from their constituents quite frequently, and in many cases on touchstone issues, very vociferously. And I predict that Republicans who might want to go along with Paul Ryan's plan to dismantle Medicare are going to have some serious second thoughts if Trump supporters start protesting outside their district offices and outside their homes in large numbers. I mean, can you imagine in an open carry state a whole bunch of Trump supporters with AR-15s slung over their shoulders harassing your wife at the grocery store because you're about to take some action they don't like? I mean, this is getting close to direct democracy. And so it'll be interesting to see if the Republican establishment is able to take advantage of Trump's election in order to shove through a lot of measures that they've had on their wish list for decades but been unable to accomplish, or whether they're going to get pushback from Trump himself and his supporters. How that plays out will be an interesting story, but it will certainly affect the country going forward for a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a particular quote in here in the book that I came across, and it was interesting to read this because you can see the unrest, especially from this election, that this causes, and it was those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. You know who said that was President Kennedy. The press has played a huge role in making peaceful reform impossible. And in fact, I think it's the press in this last election that everybody wanted to crucify.
Oh, absolutely.
And being in media for as long as I have, I remember I was even talking to some friends, and I said, I started really paying attention. I think it was back in 2002. I watched this documentary. It was called Blues Man, and it was a story of Lee Atwater. Now, maybe people may not remember who he is, but this is the guy that pretty much was responsible for getting Ronald Reagan elected, George H.W. Bush.
Karl Rove's mentor.
Yeah, George H.W. Bush, as well as George W. Bush, elected. Yeah. And he used the power of the media basically to take down their opponents.
Yeah. Lee Atwater is the subject of a fascinating play called Fixin' to Die. and I actually saw it years ago at a small theater in Hollywood, and it's about him at the end stage of his life when he knows he's dying of cancer and looking back on his career and lamenting some of the things he did and essentially asking forgiveness or whatever. But he's a fascinating guy, and he pioneered a lot of election tactics and so forth and so on. And it's kind of funny to look back on a guy who's responsible for creating Karl Rove, for getting Reagan in office and so forth, and yet he put himself through college playing in a rock band. You know, that's kind of a different background. But it's the media became a wholly owned subsidiary of the Clinton Foundation, and it's just appalling and ludicrous that now elements of the established media are ranting and raving about fake news. Geez Louise, you turn on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, you've been able to see fake news for the last 15 years. What that is really a very thinly disguised pushback against alternative media, people that have podcasts, people that have radio shows like yours, people that are online bloggers that have the time and the talent to dig down into the weeds and bring out the real story behind the party line, so to speak, the establishment line that we're fed by the mainstream news. And they're scared to death of their inability to control the narrative. They're scared about lost advertising. They're scared about losing their salaries and influence and everything else. We got a lot of people in the media who are protecting their rice bowls.
Well, that's certainly the way that I'm looking at it, and it's interesting because, again, as I was saying earlier, as I watched this, I started really paying attention to the media, especially when it came time to elections. And it was really fascinating to watch the slants. And I was thinking, well, wait a minute, this isn't the way it's supposed to work. Media is supposed to be like the ultimate watchdog in a system of checks and balances, and it's just become nothing more than a PR machine. And it was so funny to watch this election, especially watching ABC, as they all sat around looking at each other, just astounded. They just couldn't believe the outcome. And I'm thinking, how come you idiots couldn't see this coming in the first place? Really?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the supposed watchdog became the lapdog. And I watched the election coverage as well, flipping back and forth from CNN to MSNBC, and you're absolutely right. The look of stunned disbelief on these people's faces is just incredible. And when you look at the map after the election that shows the results by counties, it's virtually red from coast to coast with a couple of blue bands down each side. And there are situations where states that went blue, like New Mexico and Colorado, actually did so because of concentrated votes in certain metropolitan areas, but a numerical majority of the actual counties in the state went for Trump. And it's because these people on the coast are totally out of touch with the realities of life and economics in flyover country. I have another word for it that also starts with F, but we can't use it on the air. They're just so completely out of touch and they have such contempt for average Americans. And you can find poorly informed people on both ends of the political spectrum or on any one particular issue. But taken as a whole, Americans are pretty smart, and they have an inherent feeling for what is affecting their lives and that of their children. And you've got people working hard, as Americans have always been taught to do, and they're looking at a very perilous economic situation for themselves now. They're looking at an even worse situation in retirement, and beyond that, even worse than that for their children. And this is not the country they learned about in their 6th grade civics class. And, politicians are generally not trusted anyway, but the old axiom is all politics are local, and especially at the House of Representatives level, you better deliver for your constituents. And that's why this is going to be real interesting here to see what Trump follows up on, what he tries to follow up on and fails, and what he abandons, and how that all those different situations reverberate. Because we've got a midterm election coming up in only 2 years, and there's going to be a lot of chum in the water here for that next election if things don't go as the public demanded this time around.
Now, I know that in the book you have a character. It's interesting. Thomas Paine is his name.
Well, that's his nom de guerre.
Yeah, I kind of like that. And he had a solution that was a two-part that consisted of a return to traditional economic policy and universal military service, where, as it says in the book, where everyone received 6 months of military training and then served 18 months either in combat unit or performing public service. And I liked reading that because as I was thinking about the elections, I live in Portland, Oregon, and we were certainly on the national spotlight after the election was over with and Trump had won, about all these marching in the streets and people starting to break, windows out of office buildings and bash cars, and these were a lot of young people actually. And I was really astounded by seeing that in many ways, because I'm thinking, what are these guys so angry about? Not that hasn't happened before, but to me it seemed to be an uninformed, as you were talking about, group of people that were just looking at the surface of the reason for their anger rather than the depth of what are they really angry about. And it's very curious when you take a look at things like that.
Well, it's funny. I was born in Portland, Oregon, and I go up there to visit relatives every Christmas for a few days. But I agree completely, and of course, the conservatives have had a field day with this, because they're absolutely right when they take demonstrations like that and hold them up as an example of liberal tolerance. The liberals are supposed to be tolerant and so forth and so on, yet at the first time they don't get their way, they have a hissy fit. And but this speaks to a far greater problem. Clinton carried California, Oregon, and Washington. But if you actually look at the map, essentially what she carried was everything west of the 5 freeway, which runs from the Mexican border to the Canadian border. Now, there are little clumps around it, little mushrooms here and there where it passes through San Francisco or Portland or whatever. But essentially, the eastern part of those countries, of those states, voted for Trump. And what we have here is the coastal elites have ignored the economic reality of the center of the country for far too long, several decades at least. And in addition to ignoring it, they justify that ignorance, with contempt that somehow these people are not smart, they're not modern or cosmopolitan, they're backward, whatever, and so forth. And you cannot expect the people who live in those areas to take that kind of treatment. They'll take your social disdain just fine. If they're making a good living, providing for their family, they can look at the horizon and say, things are okay, things are not going to get too bad, things might actually be good, yada, yada, yada. But when you have contempt for them and you express that contempt with economic discrimination and ignorance, refusal to address their concerns, they're going to do what any normal person would do. And what's hilarious, to me anyway, is how ill-equipped the liberal elite have been to be on the other end of the stick. They like petulant children. Oh my God, we didn't get our way! Ah! You know, it's ludicrous.
You got to imagine now, too, now all of a sudden the Green Party is stepping up and saying they want a recount. You know, what do you think Thomas Paine would think about something like that?
Well, I think the original Thomas Paine would think it's great. It's all for it. I think one of the things that our founding fathers were very intent on is election integrity. You can't, the old chant of the Revolution, no taxation without representation. Well, obviously a corollary to that is you're going to get your representation has to be fairly elected to represent its state or its district or whatever. The Thomas Paine in my book here would probably assess it much the same way I do. Jill Stein is accomplishing two things. First of all, it's been estimated that 95% of the money that was donated for those recalls came from Democrats. That means that she's built the Green Party email list, probably doubled or tripled it, number one. Number two, she's demonstrating something that the Democrats have been loath to do, and that's challenge election results. They did a very poor job of framing the challenge in Florida in 2000, and I saw that coming from day one. They should have asked for a statewide recount. Instead, they went in and cherry-picked a few counties that they thought would go for them, and that gave the Supreme Court the excuse, the loophole, to come out with Bush v. Gore. They didn't challenge the 2004 results in Ohio, where there's pretty substantial proof that there were irregularities and vote switching and so forth and so on. The Democrats' idea is that talking is fighting. They say the right things, and that is supposed to be good enough. Meanwhile, I think all Republicans are probably, especially Republican politicians, are probably descendants in one way or another of General Sherman, because their attitude toward politics is a march to the sea and we leave nothing standing. And so, that's what I think the characters would look at it. It'll be great if these recounts actually uncover problems with the voting, counting, the vote security, vote safety, and so forth in those states. That'll be great because our election standards are pitiful. you're familiar with the Brexit vote a few months ago in England.
Right.
England managed to vote on Brexit using paper ballots that were hand-counted in public, and they still got the results out that night. We contend, if you get to the base argument, is that we have to have electronic voting machines with software that is the proprietary ownership, trade secret of the company, so that Wolf Blitzer won't have to stay up too late on election night. It's ludicrous. Paper ballots, hand counted in public at the polling place before they're transmitted to election headquarters or the county registrar's office or any of that. That's the gold standard, and that's what we should be going back to. That way there won't be any boxes of votes that disappear out of the trunk of Illinois police cars between the precinct and the election headquarters.
Now, you were talking earlier, and it was interesting to see this. Is one of the amendments that they were working to enact was limitations on the power of the executive, and I found that fascinating because I remember as former Vice President Dick Cheney was in office, he was trying to make sure that the executive, or the president, if you will, had absolute power. Because he had watched, especially under the Richard Nixon administration, how limited Richard Nixon actually was, and he should have been. And then all of a sudden, here's this guy, he's pushing this through, and then you see how all that turned out. Of the amendments also, would there be other ones that you see that should also be as important that should be enacted?
Well, before I get to that, I want to just follow up on what you said about limitations on presidential action. It is vitally important that we backtrack from this idea of the imperial presidency. And you're absolutely right about Cheney. I know that Cheney and I believe Rumsfeld as well were both in the Nixon administration.
Oh, yes.
And saw what happened there. But basically, Barack Obama, who's the greatest politician in history, no American politician has ever had his charisma and oratorical skills combined with such a complete lack of principles.
Very well put.
He campaigned on, we're going to clean up everything, and then the first thing he did is exceed Bush's wildest imaginations and institutionalized a whole lot of power in the presidency. I mean, drone assassinations of American citizens without due process, indefinite detention without charge or right to counsel for people arrested in the United States. That was actually in the 2011 National Defense Authorization Act. That's now on the books. And the Democrats went along with that, and now we're going to hand that power to Donald Trump. And there's a certain fear that comes from contemplating that, but there's also a certain amount of schadenfreude about watching the Democrats get hoisted on their own petard and watching what happens when you deviate from principles and law to personalities. This stuff's all right because Obama would never misuse it. Well, maybe Trump will, and then what? So that's very, 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 very important. I think, again, going back, we have to have an economic Bill of Rights. We have to get rid of ludicrous situations where companies can offshore American jobs to foreign countries and actually get tax credits and tax benefits for doing so. That is just completely through the looking glass. And we have to protect pensions. We have to provide pensions for people. Social Security is not enough. And senior citizens, people on pensions, help drive the economy in so many ways. They help their kids with down payments on houses. They help kids pay off college loans. They buy or purchase luxury goods or discretionary purchases. My God, the travel agents and cruise lines of the world would go broke without senior citizens. So we've got to have economic policies that ensure that the average American has a fair shot and has some protected economic power. One of the amendments that is proposed in the book is the right of anyone to sue the government to force them to enforce laws, and a corollary to that is making everything that's illegal a crime. What most people don't realize is there are a great many things that are against the law but are not a crime. For something to be a crime, it has to be against the law. It has to be the violation has to be specified as an infraction, a misdemeanor, or a felony, and there has to be a specific penalty attached to it. So we have ludicrous situations where we have laws for which there is no actual penalty for breaking them. And so what we have to do is we have to make, if it's worthy of being against the law, it's worthy of being a crime with a specified punishment. And then we have to have the ability for individuals or groups of individuals to go into court and force DAs and attorney generals and police chiefs, police departments, and so forth to enforce these laws. It just has to happen. We have to get some hands back into the power of people, because without it, you have this problem of standing. And whenever the Supreme Court or the appeals courts don't want to touch an issue, the first thing they look for is a way to claim that whoever brought the suit, the plaintiff, doesn't have standing. And in many cases, that means that that person can't prove they were harmed. So the most ludicrous example of this is people who have filed suit on civil liberties issues over government surveillance and were denied standing because they couldn't prove that they'd been surveilled before they went to court, where the object of the lawsuit was to get the release of documents that would demonstrate that they'd been illegally surveilled. I mean, we're through the looking glass here on the state secrets privilege. And what many people don't know about state secrets privilege is when the government asserts it, the government is asserting that no one, not even the judge, has the authority and the security clearance to view the material in support of the claim. The government says, if we gave you this material, we let you review it, it would harm national security, and you have to take our word for it. And where that came from was a decision, Reynolds v. the United States, back in it started in 49, it was finally resolved in the early 50s, where there was a test flight of an American bomber, and there were some civilians on board. They were testing some new radar equipment, and the plane had an engine fire, malfunction, crashed. Some of the people were able to parachute out safely, but others died. And the widow of one of the civilians who died filed suit against the manufacturer of the airplane and the Air Force because they discovered that that engine had maintenance problems, and that plane probably should not have been certify. Well, the government wanted to protect itself, and it wanted to protect Boeing, so it went to court and claimed that there were state secrets involved with the equipment that was being tested, and any revelation of that would endanger national security. And the courts went along with it. And then 50 years later, when the documents regarding that crash were declassified as part of a routine 50-year declassification, the daughter of the woman who brought the original suit made a FOIA request, got the documents, and showed that there was nothing involving national security involved. It was simply a desire to protect the United States and Boeing from liability. And that's still the foundation of our state secrets privilege. And stuff like that has got to go. If we can't trust judges to privately review material, then we don't have a justice system, and we don't have a legal system.
Now, that's quite interesting. Just yesterday I was interviewing a gentleman on his book Plutocracy, and it's how we've come to a point of inequality and how laws seem to be set up that make it difficult, if not close to impossible, for middle class as well as poor people to no longer be exploited anymore. And he was talking about the Supreme Court. He says, this is a group of people that have been so out of touch with the public. I mean, they can't even see the reality of the American public anymore. Most of them are millionaires, multi-millionaires, whatever the case is. They've been steeped in, being in the court system since birth, which I think one of the interesting things with this election I was thinking is, and I don't know how good of a President Trump will be, but it sure is interesting that somebody for the first time that I can remember, that somebody's actually been elected president without a career in politics. Because most of these people, what they generally care about is preservation, making sure they get their job for the next 4 years and the next 4 years and so forth. And, it's really interesting when he said that about the justice system, and it sounds to me like you're really pretty much saying the same thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court, this is ridiculous. Of the 8 justices we have now, 6 are Catholic, 4 are from New York State, and all of them are graduates of either Harvard or Yale Law School. Now, and only one of them, Justice Kennedy, lives on the West Coast. So, again, completely out of touch. And what this is they're part of an incestuous circle of people who went to the right schools, had the right parents, yada, 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 and that's their total circle of experience and influence. And what it says is that Stanford and Duke and Notre Dame and Michigan and Texas law schools are incapable of producing Supreme Court level justices. Oh, please, give me a break. And if you look at presidential candidates from the 2 major parties going back to, I think it's 1984, might be 88. I think, anyway, you look back, of all the presidential candidates, only 2, Bob Dole, who went to Arizona State, and John McCain, who went to the Naval Academy, did not attend either Harvard or Yale as an undergrad or for law school. That's just absurd.
Now, here's a big one that doesn't seem to be getting at least a lot of mainstream press, and it should be. And I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts, especially in relation to Public Enemies, what Thomas Paine would be thinking about this, and that's the incident that's happening in South Dakota at Standing Rock. Now, this kind of it doesn't kind of, it reminds me of the old railroad barons. You know, we were supposed to constitutionally be in a position that when we owned land, that was ours to do with what we will. And if you remember back in the days, the railroads were gaining power and political influence and so forth. They figured, well, I want to run this railroad right through your property with or without your permission. And they were doing these things, just short of actually killing the person that owned the land. I don't see that any different with what's happening here at Standing Rock. And here this company is coming in, they're laying this pipeline, and they're saying, but look, we've got the permits. And from what accordingly I read in our local paper, the Oregonian, even President Barack Obama is considering the political outcome of this whole thing. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, this is sovereign land here. This company has no right or should not even be allowed to even be granted permits to be doing this, much less turning this into a fight. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right. There are a number of interesting aspects to this and relate to my book. One of the economic Bill of Rights elements in my book is the right of protection of private property. And this goes back to SCOTUS. What you've got with the DAPL is you've got a pipeline that the residents of Bismarck jumped up and down about because they didn't want it possibly polluting their water supply, so everybody looked around and said, let's run it through the Indian land. Even though the Indian land is sovereign territory of those Indian tribes. And they didn't go in and negotiate for that land. They didn't offer to pay compensation for it. They just marched right through it up till now. Now, what's interesting about this, I've seen several GIFs on my Facebook page from friends that shows pictures of the DAPL protesters, the water protectors, being doused with fire hoses, juxtaposed with pictures of civil rights workers from the 60s being doused with fire hoses down in Selma and Birmingham and so forth and so on. It's very much the same. And now we have, I guess just today, the first veterans marched in getting ready to support the protesters. And this is interesting from the perspective of many of those police officers that are there now are veterans. They share a kinship with other veterans, and I got a pretty good idea that some of those police up there are not real happy about what they're being ordered to do. But when you introduce a whole bunch of veterans up there to augment the civilian protesters, veterans are known for being disciplined, tough guys, and so forth and so on, stand your ground types. The other aspect of this goes back to the Supreme Court. And a few years ago, the Supreme Court made one of the worst decisions since Dred Scott. It was called the Kelo decision. And there was I think it was in New Hampshire, where a city, or Connecticut, where a city wanted to build, use urban redevelopment to build a big tech center, and they set out to use eminent domain to acquire these people's properties. And one woman whose family had lived in this house for 80 or 90 years, named Susie Kelo, filed suit against it because what they were going to do was use eminent domain to take private property, not for a road or a school or a bridge or something like that, but to give it to another private party for profitable exploitation. And a justice group of lawyers jumped in and helped with the case, and they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled against that case, and in doing so, they created a new standard for eminent domain. where now governments can take private property from one individual and give it to another individual or corporation simply if it's going to be exploited more profitably tax-wise or something else. So what you've got here is they didn't even use eminent domain, because I'm not sure it applies to sovereign Indian nations, but it's the same idea. The expropriation of private property, not for public use, but for greater private use, and that's awful. Another horrible Supreme Court case is the Prop 8 California case, where that was the initiative in California that was going to ban gay marriage, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to review the case on the ground of standing, and they ruled that the people who were the proponents of the initiative had no vested rights to defend the initiative in court. And that was horrible for states that have citizen-initiated initiatives, because presumably when citizens have to do an initiative, it's because the government, the established government entities, aren't doing what the public wants. And so under this decision, now you have the state or the county or the city who didn't want the initiative anyway, is now the only entity that can defend that initiative in court. And you can imagine what an enthusiastic defense they're going to mount. In California, the legislature immediately enacted legislation to give the backers of initiatives court standing here in California, but no case has made it to the Supreme Court yet, and so we don't know if the Supreme Court is going to recognize the state's constitutional authority to convey standing. The worst you can say about the Supreme Court is not bad enough.
Isn't that the truth? You know, it's interesting because as we were talking about this, and I was remembering an incident that became a great butt of a lot of jokes, but as I looked into it more, I was really astounded, appalled, and downright frustrated, angry, I don't know, however, other many words you want to use, but that's the incident that happened in Waco, Texas, with the David Koresh compound. Now, we're supposedly guaranteed by our U.S. Constitution the right of peaceful assembly. Well, things didn't go so well down there for those guys, did it?
No, it didn't.
And that, to me, was the beginning where, you know, you're making a joke out of this, but do you realize we have now lost our government if something like this can happen?
Yeah, and, you know, the dominoes are still falling. I mean, Waco was responsible for Tim McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, but there was a phrase that you haven't heard lately, but was thrown around then, referring to federal officers as jackbooted thugs, and it grew out of this. David Koresh was known to go out and run on the public road several times a week for physical conditioning, for health. They could have very easily waited and taken him down on one of those runs, and everything would have been much simpler. But they wanted to show the government's ability to employ force. And as anybody who's watched the tapes of the initial attack can testify, they took a knife to a gunfight. They really didn't expect that kind of response by the cult members. And then everything went down hill from there. Was Koresh in violation of laws? Yes. Was he a bad guy? Yes. Was he probably engaging in pedophilia? Yeah, probably. But tactically, from a perspective purely of competence, that just showed how inept our government is. And a little trivia fact that most people don't know. There are 63 federal agencies which have their own SWAT teams, including, among others, the Department of Agriculture. Now, why the Department of Agriculture needs a SWAT team is beyond comprehension. But it's the tendency of power to acquire more power, the tendency of power to be more and more unrestrained, and it's farther and farther and farther away from what our founding fathers intended. Now, we live in a modern society with a lot of complexity, and so some of the approaches that our founding fathers took back in that time are not directly applicable here, but they can certainly be applied in a modified form, and it would be interesting if people would go back and try to imagine what the founding fathers would have done, how they would have reacted to current situations. And that was one of the things that I was getting after with my amendment suggestions in this book. You know, fiction has often been a great way to bring things to the public eye, whether it's the writing of Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis and, The Grapes of Wrath and so forth and so on. It's always been a great way to bring these issues to public attention in an entertaining fashion. But we're in deep trouble, and I just saw a statement today from Bernie Sanders that says if we don't change things, we're headed toward becoming an economic and political oligarchy. We're headed that way. I tell you, that train's reached the station.
Now, in Public Enemies, you talk about how a combination of targeted terrorist acts and massive peaceful protest could possibly produce reform, and I couldn't help, as I see that, thinking that it was back in, I think it was late 1960s, early 70s, the Weather Underground.
Well, the Weather Underground and the Black Panthers. And what's really interesting is, and by the way, I'm not espousing targeted terrorism.
No, I'm not suggesting that, right. But sometimes, when you take a look at what they did, which was pretty interesting, nobody ever got hurt, but they certainly got the attention and made statements, and none of them ever got caught.
Well, actually, the Weather Underground did have one fatality.
Did they? Okay.
One of the famous incident in New York where the building where they were building bombs blew up. One of the bomb makers was killed in that. The amazing thing is one of the other ones ended up running down the street stark naked. The explosion of fire had actually blown her clothes off, and yet she was able to disappear, and to the best of my knowledge has never been found. She managed to go underground and stay underground. But another similar group is the foundation of the Black Panthers in the 60s in Oakland. And this is interesting because California now has probably the most draconian firearms regulations of any state in the country. But back in those days, it was actually legal to carry a loaded long gun, a rifle or a shotgun, as long as it was displayed in plain view. So when the Black Panthers were founded, they started doing that, and they started going around in cars, groups of 3 or 4, following the Oakland police on their nightly rounds because they were fed up with police brutality. And they had a famous demonstration once at the California State Capitol in Sacramento where dozens and dozens of them showed up in their black leather jackets with their rifles slung over their shoulders and marched around holding picket signs. And boy, the California legislature could not act fast enough to outlaw carrying weapons in public without a concealed weapon permit and so forth and so on. And it's a perfect example of how legislators react when their personal safety is at risk. Like the book blurb says, they don't care about elections and they don't care about laws, and they've figured out how to pay off or threaten just about everybody. What they're really afraid of is lone wolf vigilante violence. And that's why they've got their gated communities and private estates and bulletproof limousines and former Secret Service agents as chauffeurs and stuff like that. It's the one thing that scares them. And the thing about nonviolent protests is that that's a misnomer. Usually, nonviolent protest, if it's successful enough, big enough, sustained for a long enough period, ends up being the recipient of violence by the establishment forces, the police, the National Guard, whatever it is. You get a lot of people dragged off, bloody, sometimes killed, depending on those situations. But massive, peaceful demonstrations are effective only in two situations. One is where they lead to external pressure that can't be avoided. And the perfect example is Britain in India. The British tried very hard to keep control of India, but the peaceful protests became such a worldwide phenomenon. Britain was so condemned for what they were doing, and the threat of economic sanctions from other countries was so great that eventually they had to give India its independence. The other side of the coin is when you have enough people protesting vociferously for a long enough period of time, there's a judgment that's made by the powers that be. We either have to give these people what they want now, or eventually their frustrations are going to boil over and they're going to go violent. They're going to say, we tried nonviolence, it didn't work. And the thing is, there's a lot more of them than there are of us. And so I would hope that we can reform this country and we can fix what's wrong with it and we can return to making it the nation that our forefathers envisioned without overt violence on the part of the reform community. But it ain't going to be easy.
Well, that's for sure. It never is easy when you live in a country like we have that is very unique compared to a lot of countries around the world. And it's interesting because, in closing here, when you think about empires themselves, the idea that there's this strange group of people in the United States that believe they're entitled to a lot of wealth and power and protection above and beyond all the other citizens, so to speak. And they don't seem to realize this is inbred thinking. Empires don't last. Rome's gone. That life somehow finds its way, one way or the other. And you got to look at that and feel kind of encouraged if you really look back on history and realize that this is true. But, as you said, it's not easy. It takes work, and you got to be willing to get in there and do the things that maybe you're just not willing to do sometimes.
Oh, you're absolutely correct. Empires don't last, whether it's the British Empire or the Third Reich or, Alexander the Great. so forth and so on. The other thing is, these elite don't just feel entitled to what we have here. They feel entitled to the use of the United States military and economic power to take whatever they want under whatever terms and conditions from any place in the world. And the people that believe this, or the people that believe that we're not really an empire, would not stand for that treatment if it was inflicted on them. The idea that we have 1,000 military bases overseas isn't to protect us from the great commie threat. It's to give us a military spearhead into every country and region in the world so that we have leverage to enforce our economic privilege for American corporations or multinational corporations that can exert influence here on our domestic policy. And it's just absurd. You know, you want to end terrorism? Stop creating terrorists.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, the drone strikes, if we have a minute here, I'd just love to get into this. You find out that 2 people in a wedding party of 50 are probably terrorists, or definitely terrorists. So you whack the wedding party with a Predator drone missile, a Hellfire missile. You kill 30 people. 20 survive. If 10% of those 30 people have one friend or relative who is radicalized and becomes a terrorist out of a sense of revenge, you've killed 2 terrorists and created 3 new ones. The math doesn't work. And but we keep on doing that kind of stupid stuff. And I know that one of the things that made Trump so appealing was his statements about, you know, if NATO wants to be NATO, then the other country's got to pay their fair share. And his statement that, you know, we shouldn't be going into every country in the world that's got a government we don't like or a resource we want. And when you combine that foreign affairs appeal with his domestic economic appeal, it was a winning formula for winning office. Now we'll see if he has a winning formula for actually governing.
Well, we'll certainly hope so. The book is Public Enemies. Our guest today joining us, Jess Money. I was curious, do you have a website people can visit, or is there a social media, something like that?
Actually, the best place to go find out, it's available exclusively at Amazon. I've got almost 100 reviews, and I'm averaging 4.5 out of 5 stars. So just go to Amazon. It's available hardcover, paperback, ebook, and audiobook. And I do have a website that we're going to be improving quite a bit shortly. I have a second book coming out sometime in the spring, and we're going to step the social media up on that. Of course, I'm on Facebook. Excuse me, my voice is getting a little raspy here. But that's the best place to go to find out about the book, get a copy of it, and read the reviews. You know, as an author, you always hope that your material will be accepted by the target audience, but I have to say I'm actually astounded by the uniform high quality of the reviews of the book. One guy wrote a few months ago, he said, "This is the best ebook ever." And I thought to myself, no, I don't think so, but thanks anyway. You know, so,
why not?
yeah, I mean, who am I to argue?
Right. Again, the book is Public Enemies. Our guest today, Jess Money. Jess, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, thank you for having me, and I'm glad you enjoyed the book, and I hope some of your readers decide to take the plunge.
Absolutely. That's what American democracy is all about. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter as well. Stay up to date on what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.